Welcome everybody to CCS Noon Lecture Series. I'm Wong, Associate Professor of Women's Studies and History. So let me make a few announcements before I introduce our speaker to you. First, next Tuesday, March 4th, is the University of Michigan's winter break. Therefore, we'll not hold a lecture at that time, so don't come next Tuesday. On Monday, March 3rd, the China Entrepreneurial Network will present a seminar in contemporary and rural China. The seminar will take place in room 2220 of the Ross School of Business from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. That is on March 3rd, Monday. More information can be found on their website at cenmichigan.com. The next presentation in the CCS Noon Lecture Series will take place in 2 weeks on Tuesday, March 11th. We will present a talk by Akiyama Tamako from Ryukyu University, who will be speaking on the liberty coerced by limitation, subtitling the independent Chinese documentary. Sounds very interesting title. And that's all for all the announcements. And we would appreciate if you could take a moment to turn off your cell phones before the talk begins. Okay. Today's presentation will be given by Mary Gallagher, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. She is also Director of the Center for Chinese Studies and a faculty associate at the Center for Contemporary Political Studies at the Institute for Social Research. From 2012 to 2013, she was a visiting scholar at the Keguan Law School at Shanghai Jiao Tong University. Professor Gallagher received her PhD in politics in 2001 from Princeton University and her BA from Smith College in 1991. She was a foreign student in China in 1989. Which month? The whole year? August to December. Okay. Very brave. 1989 at Nanjing University. She also taught at the Foreign Affairs College in Beijing from 1996 to 1997. Her book, Contagious Capitalism, Globalization and the Politics of Labor in China, was published by Princeton University Press in 2005. She is also the co-editor of several new volumes on Chinese law and politics, including Chinese Justice, Civil Dispute Resolution in Contemporary China, Cambridge 2011, and From Rice Bowl to Informalization, Markets, Workers, and the State in a Changing China. That is from Cornell 2011. She has a forthcoming book from Cambridge University Press. The title is Authoritarian Legality in China. Today she will be speaking on use the bottom to squeeze the middle, how to understand social policy in contemporary China. I think this may be a part of your new forthcoming book. Yes. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Wang Zheng, for that nice announcement and introduction. I'm going to today talk about part of the argument that's in this forthcoming book. So many things I won't talk about, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I'll try to get through all of my slides in time for plenty of questions. So let me get this technology right. I think this one can advance it. So the question I'm going to try to explain today is, why has the Chinese Communist Party passed legislation to grant workers more legal rights? Why has it publicized these new workplace rights through the propaganda system and encouraged legal mobilization around these new rights? So why is an authoritarian communist regime doing all of these things in the legal system, particularly focusing on workplace rights? And the slogan that I'm going to use, since I like propaganda and campaigns, is use the bottom to squeeze the middle, although this is not the official campaign slogan, although the Chinese Communist Party is welcome to borrow it if they would like to do so. And what is mobilizing this use of the bottom, and I'll explain what that means as I go through the lecture, is that really for autocratic governments like the Communist Party, threats to the regime often come from inside the regime itself, not from outside the regime. And that the Communist Party has to deal with various challenges. And one of the significant challenges, or really two significant challenges that it's facing, the first is controlling local governments. So a principal-agent relationship between central and local governments with a lot of conflict about where China should go, how should reform be pursued, with local governments much more focused traditionally during the reform period on growth, and the central government now more concerned not only about growth, but also about other social issues such as the environment, such as labor, such as regulatory standards. And the second challenge is, of course, the market economy. How does the Communist Party regulate its economy and firms in a state that's, very large country with a lot of regional variation and some challenges in terms of state capacity? Using the bottom to squeeze the middle is also something that we see historically in Maoist China, that there's a history of campaigns and a history of using lower level actors, using society to control the bureaucracy, which of course was most famously done in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution. So the legal mobilization that we see in a single party regime is not like what you would see in a democratic regime. It's quite different, and there are various aspects to it that I'll explain that make it so. But what I want to focus on today is this use of legal mobilization by the government through a legislative model that is defined by very high standards and low enforcement. So China's labor standards are extremely high. Its enforcement is it's varied, it's relatively low, and it's also varied across the country. But this high standard, low enforcement legislative model creates a gap, and this gap allows for social mobilization in terms of legal rights. The propaganda system actually also promotes knowledge of this gap. So by telling people about their legal rights that are not realized in reality, it creates this space for mobilization. Individualized legal mobilization is encouraged by the government. It has been encouraged by the government since the 1980s because it helps the central government control local agents and firms. But the legal system doesn't really work that well, which is something I don't talk about very much in this talk, but it's covered in the book pretty extensively. And the flaws in the legal system allows for a lot of protest spillover. And this protest spillover then requires even more government intervention in state-society relations. So I just want to point out as kind of the final conclusion that instability in China is not it's not a side effect of the system, it's part of the system itself. Like a lot of authoritarian regimes recently, China has adopted many institutions that we associate with democracy. Today I'm going to be focusing on the legal system, but we could also be having a discussion, I think, about the use of elections in China, about the legislative system, the National People's Congresses, but today I'm going to focus on the judicial system, although I will not be talking about the Bo Xilai trial. It's just a funny picture. And I've heard from many people in China that they had to find guards that were taller than Bo Xilai to really show that Bo Xilai was being managed and controlled. And they did indeed find very tall guards. So in terms of China's legislative progression in terms of labor rights, we have rights first passed in 1995 in the National Labor Law, all the way through to 2012 when the most recent, most protective law, the Labor Contract Law, which was passed in 2008, was revised, and it's cut off here, but it was revised in 2012 to become even more strict and protective towards workers. So the key laws that I focus on are the 2008 labor contract law, the labor dispute mediation and arbitration law, and these revisions later on. But the progression has generally been from more flexibility to more protection. So the laws have become more protective over time. If we compare China cross-nationally, China now has one of the most protective employment systems in the world. The line, sorry, I have two things to look at. The line here is the OECD average, which is about 2.25. This is on a scale from 0 to 6. 0 is the least protective. Of course, we have the United States as one of the least protective countries in the world in terms of labor protections. Germany over on the very high end of the OECD. China is right here. I colored it slightly differently so it would stand out. It is far more protective than any of the OECD countries, and it's more protective than some of the other major developing countries. So although we read a lot in the media about sweatshops in China, it's actually the case that on paper, China's laws are very, very protective towards workers. Just to give you a sample of some of the rights that Chinese workers have on the books, China uses a written labor contract system. It has termination for cause, which means you cannot, you have to be fired for a reason. It's not employment at will. Now they require severance compensation when a contract expires and when you're terminated. There are restrictions now since 2008 on short-term contracts, so employment security is increased and flexibility is decreased. In the most recent revision to the laws, labor subcontracting has now been restricted to 10% of the total workforce, although that will be phased in over time. And terminations require notification of the trade union, and layoffs require government notification. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that these laws are actually realized on the ground, which is part of the point of this gap in the laws on the books and laws in reality. But that gap does promote the ability and the space for mobilization. If we look at minimum wage increases, there have been significant increases in the minimum wages in most major Chinese cities. And as part of the current fifth-year plan, minimum wage increases should continue to go up about 13% every year until 2015. And wages itself, real wages themselves, have also increased fairly rapidly since the mid-2000s, particularly among migrant workers. As part of the high standards and low enforcement and the gap in protection is the importance of people knowing about the laws. The laws wouldn't really matter very much if people didn't know about the laws. China has pursued something called legal dissemination campaigns or legal education campaigns since 1986. And this is a very concerted government campaign. It's now, I think it's in its sixth fifth-year campaign to disseminate legal knowledge broadly to the public for both social control and for mobilization. And I want to just quote briefly from the white paper on China's legal system in 2008. The target of popularizing the knowledge of law is every citizen, and the focus is civil servants. For ordinary citizens, popularizing the knowledge of law not only aims to make them know the laws and abide by them, that's the social control aspect. More importantly, it is to enable them to use the laws as a weapon to protect their lawful rights and interests. And since the mid-90s, with the passage of all these new labor laws, we've seen a focus in the campaigns on workplace rights. So again, in comparison, in a comparative perspective, cross-nationally, China's rule of law publicity really is quite dramatic because it's so far away from all of the other measures of rule of law where China actually does quite poorly. Only when we look at this one measure, which is this is out of an index to measure rule of law cross-nationally. There's one measure called open government and regulatory enforcement, and one of the sub-factors is are laws publicized and accessible. So if we look, China's purple. So if we look at all of these other aspects of the measure, China is far below the standards of upper middle income countries and far below regional comparisons. So this is East Asia, this is income. And so China, as purple, is usually below all of those other standards, with the exception of laws are publicized. If we look at it compared to other countries, specifically China's here, next to Denmark and Slovenia. Germany is actually below China. France is is that Finland? Finland and France are slightly above China. So China's sort of squarely in the middle of laws are publicized and accessible. So it ranks low in rule of law measures generally, but for this one measure, China does fairly well, which I think adds more evidence to this idea of the power of legal education and dissemination. Over the years of doing this research project, I've collected lots of material about legal education. This was one that was done after the labor contract law was passed in 2008. They're obviously playing cards. It was actually funded by the U.S. government, and money was given to an NGO to do this. So as the migrant worker is playing cards, he can notice that when I'm during my probationary period, I should be paid nothing less than the minimum wage of the region that I'm working in. So he gets a little bit of legal knowledge as he plays poker. This is a book that was prepared by Zhongshan, a legal aid center at Zhongshan University for women's rights, with a story and cartoons about our labor contracts that forbid marriage legal. So this is really something for people to consume who have relatively lower levels of education but want to understand their legal rights at the workplace. And so they use cartoons. Wong, she signs a contract that says that she can't get married. After a couple of years, her boyfriend proposes. She wants to get married. The boss fires her, and she very bravely goes to labor arbitration right here. She confronts the big door of justice alone, it seems, with no legal aid, but hopefully she got some legal aid. And here the decision is reached. The contract is illegal because it interferes with her right to marriage. Now, this kind of legal education material is common. This is NGO material or university aid material, but legal aid material. But the government's use of propaganda and the media system is very similar in the sense that it's to popularize the law and to make the law accessible to people without high levels of education. If we look at surveys, we see that increasingly people actually know a lot about their workplace rights. So there does seem to be some evidence that legal education is actually working. This is the China Urban Labor Force Survey from 2010, questions that go from general to very specific, comparing local residents to migrants. And I'm not surprised by this. So as you get more specific, fewer people know their rights. But if we look at the very important sort of general rights, the level of knowledge is very high, and the gap between local residents and migrants is not that wide. If you do statistical analysis of awareness, we find that it's correlated with higher levels of education and with higher age. Middle-aged people know the most about the legal system and workplace rights. Firm ownership is not significant. So in many, many different firms, you see this high awareness. And in this survey, women are more likely to be aware of their legal rights than men. That may also be because they face more discrimination at the workplace. So the results of this high standards, lots of dissemination about rights, has been some improvements, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the improvements. Very high expectations, higher expectations among workers, and I don't think surprisingly, much more conflict. So as these rights have been propagated and publicized, there's more conflict. So it's not the case that as things get better, conflict is decreasing. As things get better, actually conflict is increasing because expectations are also rising. Migrant wages have increased pretty dramatically since 2004, when we first began to see reports of labor shortages in labor-intensive manufacturing in China, and they continue to go up, although a little bit more slowly the last few years. Labor informality has been somewhat reduced since the labor contract law was passed in 2008, although many people now are working in labor subcontracted relationships, which means they don't have a lot of security. But there's been some decrease in informality. And social insurance participation rates are also going up. So more and more people, including migrant workers, are starting to buy into, and their employers are buying into the system of pensions and medical insurance, although the rates in some areas are still pretty low. This is just a picture from a strike that happened just a few days ago. There's lots of information on the internet if you want to just find strike, daily or daily there must be 3 or 4 that are reported in the media. This is a strike in Guangdong province, and the signs that people often use both moralistic and legalistic language to press for a settlement. So in terms of compliance since 2008, one of the big dramatic increases that I want to point out, because it's really important for the long term, is that migrants are increasingly getting written labor contracts. The rate in 2005 in the China Urban Labor Force Survey was just over 10%. It's now over 30%. So in 5 years, there was about a 20% increase in migrants signing contracts. Migrants who are in wage work, who are young, have even higher rates of written labor contracts. Now that's important because that's eventually the way they're going to get this. The way that they're going to get social insurance is through written labor contracts. And that is going to be a much harder battle for the government to fight, because that's going to require that firms participate in social insurance and local governments participate in social insurance for migrants. But the way that the government gets to this is through written labor contracts. For local residents, it was already a fairly high rate, but it's gone up a little bit more since then, and it tends, again, to be much higher among younger people and among people with education. Mm-hmm. Migrant, I'm sorry, I should explain that. Migrant is just to mean a person who does not have a local residency permit, so is not a legal resident of the place that he's working in or she's working in. Because in China, you're defined by where you're born and where your hukou is. It's called hukou, but it means where you're registered legally. So these are people who are Chinese, but who do not have legal residency long-term in the city that they're working in. Now, if you look at retirement insurance, there's very small increase. The increase is a little bit more significant for local residents, but this is partly explained by the fact that migrants don't want to participate in this right now because they don't trust it, because they don't think that they will be permanently able to have access to this retirement insurance. So this is what's going to be happening in the next 10 to 20 years as urbanization increases, as the central government, as one of its new goals, says we want to increase urbanization and we want migrants to become permanent residents of the places that they're working in. And that will cause a lot of conflict between local governments, migrants, and local residents. And that's something that I'm not going to talk about today, but will be a big issue in Chinese politics the next decade or so. But this is really the way that they even become urbanized citizens to participate in social insurance partly becomes by becoming formal employees of the places that they're working in. Of course, disputes, like I said, there are some signs of improvements and more compliance, but there's also a lot of sign of conflict. And the conflict increases in big jumps as these laws are passed. So the labor contract law went into effect in 2008. Disputes doubled in that year. The social insurance law that starts to extend social insurance to migrants goes into effect in 2010. There's another big jump between 2009 and during 2010. There are other things going on, of course. There's the global financial crisis that led to a lot of unemployment among migrant workers and other workers as well. And we may expect to see another big jump after the 2012 revisions to labor subcontracting go into effect. But again, this is not unexpected given that people's expectations are increasing as the laws become more protective. So what's happened since 2008, and this is the story about instability, is that the party has not stepped back from these policies of more protection and of increasing sort of interest in things that are not just about economic growth, but that are also about social justice and equality. But they have had to take a much more direct role in settling social instability. So they can't leave it to the legal system. From 1995 to 2008, there was a reliance on the legal system, on arbitration and on litigation to handle workplace disputes. More and more, the party is stepping in directly to settle disputes, particularly collective disputes that threaten social stability. So we see in 2000, and this goes back to the disputes that I just showed, these are the disputes of that year that reached arbitration. Now, arbitration is the first formal step of resolution of a labor dispute. And we see this huge increase in 2008. But then, sort of strangely, we see it really kind of plateau. And it's not the case that disputes go down. Disputes are actually still increasing. But what's happening is that the party and the governments, local governments, have been much more proactive in mediation and in informal settlement. So they're not stepping back from this pursuit of legal protections, but they're not leaving it to the legal system for resolution. Now, strikes and demonstrations in China are also increasing, although it's very hard to get accurate data on strikes. This is from China Labor Bulletin, which is an NGO in Hong Kong. And this is through crowdsourcing. So they basically follow the media and follow Weibo. They try to confirm strikes, and then they enter in the number of strikes that have occurred in a given month. It's probably unreliable to some degree, particularly at this stage, because there's sort of a knowledge effect as people start to know about the reporting and maybe are reporting more strikes to China Labor Bulletin. But I think in general, when you talk to people who study labor or labor activists in China, there is a sense that strikes are a normal occurrence. Strikes are happening every day. And there's a seasonal effect too. So strikes are very, very common right before Chinese New Year, when a lot of people leave and go back to the countryside. No, this is just like 70. This is actually the number of strikes that were reported to China Labor Bulletin through various social media or media. So if anything, it probably underreports the number, but I think it's capturing maybe a trend of increasing disputes. And there's been some very famous disputes in the media around social protest. The Honda strike in 2010, which led to the shutdown of Honda's entire production in China in the spring of 2010, and led to a lot of copycat strikes in the auto industry in general. The Foxconn suicides that happened in the same year. And then more recently, was just a funny thing that happened when I was living there last year. Rather than threatening to commit suicide or violence, these workers who had not been paid their wages decided to dance Gangnam Style. Because you have to have the media show up. If the media doesn't show up and you don't get on Weibo, you won't get any attention. And you want the media to pay attention, because then the government will pay attention. So to get back to this, what's the government doing about the increasing instability as they've pushed for these new laws, is that more and more of the disputes are going to these various types of informal but party-led mediation. So mediation through a neighborhood committee, mediation through a street-level committee, mediation at the company, mediation via the trade union, mediation sometimes through the arbitration system, and of course other types of more formal mediation at the court system. But that would be in these red lines. But more and more of it is being done kind of ad hoc at the very grassroots level. So the government, as a response to the instability and as a response to social pressure, has not gone in the direction of liberalization, of democratization, of giving the trade union more power. It's gone in the direction of directly handling social stability. Right? This is something that it has to now directly handle. So to conclude and take some questions, I want to call China's authoritarianism populist, because by using the bottom to squeeze the middle, it's using bottom-level social pressure to put pressure on local governments and firms from the central government. Now, it's not a story of democratization. It's a story of mass mobilization, which is much more in not traditional Chinese culture, but perhaps we might want to say traditional communist Chinese culture from the Maoist period. Because legal institutions function poorly, there's this spillover effect on protest, and the government needs to then step in and reassert itself. So labor capital conflict, or conflict between employers and workers, is increasingly more about conflict between workers and the state. So if the company is unresponsive, you go to the government, and you do something big to get the government's attention and to get a settlement. So social conflict in China, we often hear about it in the media. We hear about the threats of instability, and we hear about how the government is worried. But I just want to point out in conclusion that it's an interesting point that social conflict is actually partly because of the government's own policy, that the government is using social conflict as a way to drive policy reform. Thank you. Larry.
Mary, can you, am I understanding right when you're talking about the increased public campaigns about the laws and the strong laws but the weak enforcement, is part of the weak enforcement the local government's response to this being pressured by the central government? So in fact, the central government seems to be making the case is trying to put pressure on the local government, and part of the lack of enforcement is in fact kind of a de facto response by the local government not to be pressured with this.
Right. So law enforcement, law implementation and enforcement in China in a decentralized system is done by the local governments. So the laws that I've been talking about have been passed by the central government. The local governments then implement those laws and enforce those laws. But as many laws, like environmental standards as well as food safety standards, those laws receive a lot less attention from local governments, particularly when they interfere with economic growth and attracting investment. So the central government, which used to, I think, be fine with that kind of model, is now increasingly concerned about it because people are upset about environmental pollution or labor standards or food safety. And so one way to get more traction on enforcement is to use bottom-up pressure. I mean, if I've looked also at labor enforcement and implementation at the local levels, it's a very reactive system. It's a system that's responsive to complaints. So there are two ways that it could happen. It could happen through arbitration or filing a labor dispute, like I showed with the woman who had who was fired for wanting to get married. You can go to the arbitration, you can file a lawsuit. There are other ways that you can do it anonymously to the government. But both of those systems of enforcement are very reactive to worker complaints. So you need worker complaints for the system to work. And one way that worker complaints have been activated is through this very high standards and a lot of publicity.
When Americans turn on the media and they hear that there are lots of disputes in China, I think the meaning that they get is negative. Whereas what you're saying is it's not a positive, and there's some hopefulness to it.
I don't think disputes are a sign that something. I think a sign of high disputes is a good sign in China. And if you look across provincial variation in terms of disputes, the place with the highest disputes, you can probably guess, or the places with the highest number of disputes are places like Shanghai, Jiangsu, Guangdong. They're not places like Shanxi. They're not places where you would see a lot of workplace death, for example. So the places with very high levels of, say, death from mining or death from unsafe working conditions tend to occur in provinces that don't have a high rate of disputes, which isn't to say that conditions are perfect in a place like Guangdong, because you also have really significant problems there as well. You have a lot of occupational disease and injury in those places as well, but you also have a lot of disputes. So one thing that I did last year as part of my research was interview people in the Shanghai region who had black lung disease, and they had black lung disease from working in factories and inhaling a lot of dust. But they were pursuing settlement and getting occupational disease insurance through these channels, where I don't think you see anywhere near the same number of people doing that in a place like where you have a lot of coal mining, where you might also have black lung, but you don't have the same responsiveness. Yeah.
Do you think using the social pressures, like the bottom-up approach, is more effective than the top-down model? So, like, I mean, the law enforcement from the central government. Do you think the bottom-up is more effective?
I think they work in concert with each other. I don't think you could have either one. But what I would emphasize is that the reason why you see this type of bottom-up legal mobilization is because the government has closed off another possibility, which would be collective representation through collective bargaining and collective contracts, and more powerful and more independent trade unions. But they don't want to go in that direction because it's politically threatening, and therefore they've gone in a direction of much more individualized bottom-up legal mobilization, which I'm not comparing its effectiveness to these other modes, but what I would say is that it's extremely inefficient, and it's extremely costly to the government to now intervene directly in labor conflict like the way that it is. but it's a choice that they've made because of the fear of what collective organization would mean. What is the challenge?
For the central government to enforce the
Well, the central government doesn't have control. Even though China's a centralized system, it's not a federal system, it's still the case that most law enforcement and law implementation is done by local governments. And if local governments are not interested in doing it well, the central government has to find other mechanisms to push local governments to enforce the law. And this is one way that they do it. There are other ways that they do it as well, but this is one major way for labor. Yeah, and there you, and then, yeah.
Thank you. Can you go to the last slide? I'd like to point out the last slide. Yeah, keep going. Yeah, I think they utilize the individual legal, which is the bottom, as the title push upwards. Mostly the immediacy is the middle level of the people in China. It's some kind of like creative, however works, but it's from 2008 as your chart showing that there are problems generated more, but they also plateau. In the whole world right now, including whatever Western world, Eastern world, communists, the capitalists, the difference between rich and poor, have and have not, is keep increasing. However, the things that still stay in here, the revolution way failed all over. Bloody and barbarian. So this way is kind of like remind me. I like the term, but if I can quote, you see, in the second item is a legal institution function poorly. This is the truth. Why? Either you revolution smash that, everything, or you just say we find some way. I would use the social engineering term instead of political revolutions or whatever. It's some kind of like bioengineering. You have the engineering. We have physical engineering, you have anything, but there is nothing considered as a big engineering concept. I think this kind of thing is very interesting, but the term knowledge is confusing because of there's if you look at it, Google it, social services, including social workers, and then just another social revolution or social scientist. There's nothing in between. The Chinese government can handle these things. Is already some kind of thing interesting to pay attention. Thank you for your research.
Well, I know, but I would point out too that the way that they're handling, and this is what I mean by inefficiency, it requires, so now we know, for example, last year, I think it was released, the military budget now is smaller than the budget for internal security. So internal security, this kind of Weiwen that I'm talking about, is hugely inefficient and maybe unsustainable. I mean, it has worked until now, but it does mean that the government, because it has chosen to do it in this way, has now committed itself to intervening in labor capital conflict. It is not going to allow labor or capital to have the autonomy to resolve those disputes itself.
That explains it because you have that.
I know, but I'm going to take another question because there were a lot of people. Yeah, behind, and then Ryan.
I'm interested in how you see the parallels between what's going on in China now with the activism influencing what the government does, being used as prompts for things they want to do anyway, with the way LBJ dealt with civil rights activism in the United States.
You want me to compare it to what happened with LBJ and the civil rights movement?
It looks similar to me that you had the activism which you then use as a prompt for getting little changes that you wanted.
Yeah, it's harder to make those links when in Chinese politics because it's not clear to me exactly, maybe as somebody who doesn't study elite politics, how. I mean, I do know. Okay, so how are these laws being passed at the central government level? So there is, I think, a belief among people who are reformers that China needs to make these adjustments for other reasons, not for equity, not for social justice. They need to do this if they want to grow out of being a middle-income country and attract a lot of high-tech investment and become a successful, wealthy country, that they can't rely on sweatshops forever. And so what do you do to improve sweatshops? This is one way to improve sweatshop conditions, by by getting support for better conditions from the bottom. But
You can say to your cohort, look, you have to do this because otherwise there's going to be this distressing action from the lower levels.
right, right.
LBJ was reacting to about civil rights.
Yeah. Right?
If the increased involvement of local governments in mediation is forcing higher budget expenditures for these local governments, then are there any instances regionally of those local governments then having to invest so much of their budget in these kinds of labor capital relations that it is really constraining their ability to use those funds in other sectors of their governance? Therefore, like, other fires are sort of springing up around them. And so I guess it comes to, could a situation evolve in the next, couple of decades or whatever, where the bottom is squeezing the middle so hard that the middle just cannot sort of perform other forms of governance, like investment, public education?
I don't know. I haven't looked at that, but I think one way that you can see how there is variation in how local governments respond to labor protest, and there are places that I know better, like in Shanghai or in Guangdong, where there's a lot of money, and you use money. You just buy people off with money, and you use money in a very effective way because you make sure that the leaders are treated much more harshly than the followers. But when you read about labor protests in other parts of China that are much poorer, I think, I haven't studied this systematically, but what I would expect is that violence is a much more important tool right at the get-go. So if you have money, money is better because money will keep things sort of tapped down and relatively more stable. But if you don't have money, then violence becomes a tool, much more importantly. Jersey.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm very interested in your talk, but you clearly focus on the labor law
Mm-hmm.
area, and I'm wondering about other sectors, for example, healthcare,
Mm-hmm.
or environmental protection, which you mentioned. To what extent, in your theory, could it apply to other sectors?
Certainly for the environment, I think there is some indication, although I haven't looked at it myself, but of the things that I've read, there does seem to be some support for more transparency, more public reporting of environmental crimes, and using that as a way to get the governments to crack down on it. But for health care, a little bit for healthcare insurance. So again, the government is trying to increase the participation rates of migrants into social insurance. And this is another, so after pensions, health insurance is probably the most critical and the biggest. And again, it's not all about caring about social justice or equality. A lot of localities in China that are doing it quickly are doing it because their own populations are aging, and they need to get young migrants paying into the system as a way to keep the system going. So as I think that's a very effective way to keep momentum for the policies, is that it's not just about social justice or equality, because I don't think all leaders care about those things, but that it's also about either changing China's development model or increasing social insurance participation among migrants to help pay for China's aging workforce. Okay, Mike and Emily, and then Wang Zhang, and then okay, go ahead.
Could you talk about the role of the media a little bit? So media is really important because it's gathering attention for your protest or your strike is important to getting a government response. But we all know that Chinese media is censored. Does that censorship take place at such a higher level that the local governments don't influence it? Because the idea is that the local governments don't want attention, so that they can continue to have labor capital relations.
Right, so censorship happens at the local level. It also can happen at the central level. And if you follow certain strikes or protests, you can sometimes see the tipping point where censorship then steps in. So for example, with the Honda strikes and the Foxconn suicides in 2010 were reported widely in the Chinese domestic media and were not heavily censored. And the Foxconn suicides got more publicity in China, I think, because they were more dramatic and more emotional and harder to explain, frankly, why young people would be committing suicide in a kind of copycat fashion. The Wen Jiabao, who was the premier at the time, did not directly make a statement on the Honda strikes, but he was asked about them in a press conference, and he said Chinese workers' wages should go up. which seemed to indicate support for the strikes. And the strikes continued at the point where workers started to demand their own independent union. Censorship began. So it's a system that's flexible, and it's a system that tries to tweak both publicity and censorship in a way that will help the government promote policies that it supports, but also not allow for things that it doesn't support. For legal education, the media has been hugely important, and I didn't show anything of that, but if you looked at sort of law programs, law newspapers, law journals, after the 1986 announcement of that campaign, increased very dramatically. Now, not all propaganda would be interesting to people. Legal education propaganda proved particularly interesting to people, so it continued and had a commercial success. Emily?
Yeah, can you explain what happens after the local strikes or various types of problems are reported in the media, and then either the local government or the central government steps in? What happens after that? Is there then enforcement, and if so, just in that company or in that region? What exactly happens?
Well, a lot of different things happen depending on how much publicity the strike got and how well the workers are organized to continue. In the case of very high-profile strikes, like the Honda strikes, there's been some attention to what's gone on afterwards, and there's a sense that they got very big wage increases. They got some of the things they wanted. It was difficult for the representation issue to continue because for various political reasons and also for some reasons that are not related to politics. In many companies in China, particularly in labor-intensive manufacturing, turnover is something like 90% a year. So the workforce is constantly turning over, which makes representation really difficult. So strikes tend not to have they don't have a huge institutional effect on the firms afterwards, partly because of that reason, and also because of representation. That even if people are elected initially who the workers support, usually by the second or third year, people are put back in who are much more under the thumb of companies.
So the squeeze is just like a very temporary thing?
No, I would say the squeeze is more of the squeeze in a single instance makes only a small effect. The squeeze over many of these instances over the longer term creates a bigger effect, I think. And I think partly the what's the word that I would use, the word social instability or the fear of social instability in China, I think maybe is partly part of this, is that the government allows for a fear of social instability because the government is managing social instability, but also promoting it at the same time. So, Wang Zheng?
I think the concept you propose here, China's populist authoritarianism, is a fabulous concept that charts so well of what I try to figure out as a historian.
Mm-hmm.
I approach the thing entirely different from your approach, in the sense that I try to understand at this particular historical moment what has been the residue of the Maoist period. That is populist,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
The mobilization campaign, everything informed the masses and to rely on masses agency to take issue in their hands. So that part is there. Another part, authoritarianism, of course, is still there. However, I think the nature of that part has changed a lot, in the sense that the state is in collaboration with the capital,
Mm-hmm.
from the top down to different levels of government. And also the legal institutions, they're part of the state,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not, it doesn't have the connotation of legal institution here as an independent
Right.
entity. So right now, after all these years, in the 80s, Hu Yaobang or Zhao Ziyang, that generation, that leadership, they kind of designed this, open up a rule of law and try to implement law to reduce, in a sense, to reduce the power of the government. Okay, try to give more power to legal system.
Right.
But in the design of the political system, they're not separated at all.
Right.
Right. So right now, after all these years practice, especially with the tremendous increase of the power of capital, not in terms of how they change society, also how they control the government. They collaborate with the government. And the officials, either you're in the court or you're in the municipal government, they have very deep relationship with big money.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in that sense, the mass become even more powerless. So that's why I think you point out that the increase of the disputes and the gap here has been increasing in a sense.
Yeah, so it's a very dangerous.
Exactly.
It's a very.
Exactly.
It's
so that is why they increase the money for Wei-1.
Right.
Right. They need more money for Wei-1. So now today I listen to those NGOs organizations all the time, and a lot of NGOs, especially in the labor field, because they are immediately confronting the capital, and capital is in collaboration with the state power. So anybody, if you want to get into any disputes involved some big companies, then you're basically confronting with the government. Mm-hmm. Okay, so many of those activists, they are so disillusioned mm-hmm. in this legal procedure, actually.
Right.
And a lot of lawyers, they say, forget it, I enter the law, I want to fight for social justice. But now I found it's impossible.
Right, so people, I mean, yeah, I think you're right, and I think people don't see the legal system as something that's going to save them. The legal system is part of a strategy that requires also public attention, it requires social pressure, it requires often what I think is more and more evident is extreme behavior. You need to do something that is equally extreme to get the government's attention and to get the government actually to play a more proactive role. So it's actually, you know, it may be unsustainable. It's very inefficient. But again, I think it was a decision to avoid the kind of reforms that people in the 1980s thought were necessary, such as political liberalization. Yep.
Yeah. Huawei, spent a huge amount of money just to dismiss all his staff.
Yeah, I know.
And then hire them back,
mm-hmm.
just to avoid the negative impact in the long run, caused by this law. So it's a kind of, it's not the win-win situation, it's a kind of lose-lose situation. So I want to know, what do you think about, such kind of thing? Because, this law, some people, some normal, staff, they have lost their position. So I want to know what do you think about this, and what do you expect given the next 2 points?
Yeah, so that's a good question, but it's a really complicated question. I'll only answer it partly. The labor contract law made China's standards very, very high. Some people argue that those standards are too high because China does not have the capacity to implement such a law. And therefore, the people that will benefit from the law will be people who are more highly educated and people who have the ability to make use of these institutions to protect their rights. And that is actually what happened. People who are more highly educated are more able to use these laws to protect themselves. So people who are at the bottom of the labor market didn't necessarily benefit from the labor contract law. I wouldn't say, the response in China about is a law win or lose, or is it lose-lose? I mean, a law is a law, and a law will create disputes. And that's, I think, the thing that the government sometimes doesn't anticipate enough, that if you give those rights to workers, companies will try to find a way around them. And that's exactly what happened in the labor contract law, is that as the stricter contract time went into effect, a company like Huawei decides, we're going to lay off, we're going to terminate all 8,000 of our employees and re-sign new contracts with them so that we don't have to give them these non-fixed term contracts, so that we can, give them shorter time periods. And in the end, actually, Huawei was not permitted to do that. The Guangdong Trade Union interfered, and they had to step back. So anyway, we can talk later about the law. It's complicated. But So you haven't asked questions. So there were two people that I wanted to get, you and there was somebody over there, and you. Okay, and then I'll stop.
So my question is more about education and literacy. And so you mentioned you had a lot of different examples of different types of propaganda that's being disseminated. My question is more of, are there any, or is there any evidence of very specific types of propaganda to particular provinces based on literacy rates or based on kind of education level?
I haven't seen any evidence that shows that. I mean, I think what NGOs try to do in particular, maybe more so even than the government, but even the government, state-run newspapers do try to make the knowledge accessible to people with lower levels of literacy. China has very high rates of literacy in any case, and so most of the propaganda is easily understandable for people who have elementary school education. So for example, the use of cartoons and the use of stories is probably the most dominant. So it's a very real experience, and it's and then it might spell out at the end like, okay, this is what you know about this case. These are the relevant legal regulations that you need to know. It doesn't mean that it's not confusing, because it is a very confusing and very long process. So the legal education, I think, has contributed to higher expectations that are not met in reality. So when you actually go to file a labor arbitration claim, particularly after 2008, like Wong did, it may take you 1 or 2 years to get resolution. And not because you don't understand the law, but because the institutions don't work well. And the last question, yeah? It's not I'm not making a class distinction. It's really that the central government is at the top, and the central government makes these laws. The local government and the firms implement the laws, and the workers push from below for implementation. So when I'm talking about the middle, I'm thinking local governments and firms, who are really the ones, and I should probably say this at the beginning, those are the units that are responsible for implementation and compliance. And if they don't comply, this type of bottom-up mobilization has become one of the major ways that the government has put forward for better compliance. So I'm going to stop there because we're a little bit beyond. Thank you.